So Harry, in the first video, we talked about how you moved from CSS to performance and how web performance is very important for business. And then we discussed the fact that there are, web performance is all the way, there's full spectrum of things that you need to deal with. And you said like it starts with the backend, way down the back in the backend and infrastructure. Maybe we discuss a little bit this one. Maybe this is the one that you deal with the least, and then we can move into the other topics closer to the other side.
Sounds good.
So what about the backend?
So for me, even though I understand sort of backend stuff the least, it's really important for me to admit that if you've got backend and infrastructure problems, any work you do on the front end is just trying to play catch up, right? So you need to solve back-end infrastructure things first. And that could be in many, many different ways. So working with, for example, Prismic, right? Headless company. So it's a lot of shuffling data around with APIs perhaps, and it's just making calls to the right things. That's traditionally going to have quite a small footprint and would be quite fast by default. So clients who I work with like that, what they can tend to do is defer a lot of the back-end work to APIs, obviously make sure their APIs are running nice and quick, but then everything that they control on the front end is entirely up to them, and they can make it fast or slow.
So basically the first thing, what I understand is that you to get something, a stable response time from the APIs. This is what you want to be guaranteed.
Yeah.
Because if that's not stable, nothing, you can't optimize anything. It's a mess.
Yeah, exactly. If you've got, if your time to first byte is a second, you've already lost a tremendous amount of time there. So you need to be way faster. Now, I've worked with clients who, they haven't worked in headless environments, but they've had a lot of sort of GraphQL on the back end perhaps, and it's just been really expensive and really badly optimized. Now, I can't go in and tell them how to optimize that necessarily, but we can do things like, instrument it on the back end, get sort of coverage on how long things take, and then start to drill down what's going on.
Right.
Then once all that is solved, just wrapping that in whatever you want, which is the beauty of headless, right?
Right.
Because
so headless basically is that you have something that provides you with an API, and it's already dealt with.
Yeah, give me the raw data, make sure that's fast. Whatever you wrap around it is entirely under your control, and you're in the position to make it as fast as you want. And that also balances things like developer experience, right? If you prefer maybe Jamstack over Ruby, you don't have to be forced down the Ruby path by whatever CMS or e-commerce platform you've chosen. So I think that's held a lot of my clients in really good stead, is going to sort of an API-based model, or at least just having raw data that they can consume exactly as they see fit. And then also not having any dead weight around it. So traditional CMS or traditional e-commerce platform might have loads of other stuff, whether it's necessary, whether it's architectural, whether it's application, whatever. It just could have loads of unnecessary stuff in the way, and that could be making your application slower. Whereas if you can strip it back to just give me the data.
Yeah. Just give me the raw data, good response time, and let me handle everything else.
Exactly.
And like from the framework side, if we talk about, because then whenever you get the raw data, you will have an app that will be kind of getting these calls and then doing some HTML or some DOM with it for the rendering. Do you have any advice or any experience on that?
For most cases, for nearly every case that I've seen, whatever framework you want to use, just server render it. Like server render it and hydrate it on the front end, or rehydrate subsequent page loads.
Yeah. Okay.
Purely because that's the best way to be fast. I've worked with a lot of clients who they've gone full JavaScript in their browser. The immediate problem you've got there is you've got potentially several megabytes of runtime to download before you can even start manipulating your own data.
So nothing shows until you download all of these.
Exactly. I won't, just out of, there aren't any non-disclosure things, but just out of good taste, I won't name any clients. But I've worked with clients who they've had server rendered sites which have been mega fast, and the cost of Express flattening down React into a server rendered application is actually faster than the API calls. So that's kind of continuing what we're talking about APIs.
Right.
We managed to find out, oh my goodness, the cost of actually server rendering React is far less than actually making the API call. Whereas on the flip side, I've had clients where they've gone full React in the browser, not tree shaken any of it, not done any code splitting, and the developers say things like, oh, well, they can download React once and it'll be cached forever. And you look at their caching headers and it's like, well, it won't because you've not actually set any caching headers. So
there's that as well, yeah.
Yeah, so there's loads of stuff like that. And another one I'm coming up against at the moment with a client is they did go for the server render. So actually their first render on screen is really, really fast. But then they're not actually trimming down their API calls. So the actual amount of calls they're making from the very front end there's way too many of them, but it's also returning way more data than they need.
Mm-hmm.
So what they've actually got is almost a bottleneck in their front end where the APIs are as fast as they want, right? The APIs return the data really quickly. They're just getting fire hosed by it. They're just trying to consume way too much of it. So that's when we go back onto the back end and say, right, well, cache these queries for 15 minutes. Nobody needs genuine real-time, most popular
navigation, for instance, something you query in every page.
Right, exactly.
But you don't need every second that to be updated, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
So what's interesting is API-based models give you a lot of flexibility, which could be argued that developers need to have a really good overview of everything that's going on, because if they can just grab data from wherever, they need to make sure they're using it responsibly. But also it does mean that you can respond to things very quickly. So with clients that I've sort of just described, we can bounce between front and back end and try and work out all the time that, oh no, here's your bottleneck. Oh, now it's here. And I think that's quite an interesting paradigm. That's quite an interesting environment to work in.
So but from there are several things you talked about that are, kind of interesting. First, you told about server rendering, and then now we see like on top of React and Vue, there are several technologies trying to kind of go that path and provide server rendering.
Mm-hmm.
First, there is Gatsby, which is completely static. It's compiled in static time, so it gets all the content and then it produces it. And then you get something like Nuxt and Next, that server render, and also they have an export option, I guess, to do that. So everyone is like, I feel like all the frameworks are trying to go towards that. That's from one side. And then you talked about fetching too much data or doing too many calls.
Mm-hmm.
And that's interesting because it's, as you're saying, it goes like a lot of round trips to the server. And the more you do, the more delay you have. But also you think about the modeling of your content, and that's from our side. For instance, when you have a page, and developers tend to break it into two little pieces because developers we like to break things into little pieces and assemble them. But sometimes, and this gets me back to my memories of dealing with databases, and when people started talking about normalize your database so that you get it with one query instead of doing all these kind of joins and I don't know if you run into that kind of period where we started talking a lot about normalizing databases.
Yeah.
So but maybe GraphQL is also helping with that, to fetch a lot of data together instead of doing different queries.
Yeah. This is sort of straying out of the kind of thing I deal with, but it does abstract a lot of that problem away, or at least remove a lot of that problem. So generally, as long as you're stepping carefully, you can get just as much data as you need. The good thing about doing hydration on the front end as well is that you can hydrate components individually.
Mm-hmm.
So you could have your server rendered first pass might be critical content, but anything that could be done lazily around that, you're going to introduce more round trips. But if it's peripheral content, like for example, a sidebar of trending topics on Twitter, let's have a second API call. Let's have more round trips, because there's no point clogging your critical data with this kind of transient, less important stuff. So it does, again, give developers, as long as they're thinking about things correctly, the ability to design very bespoke solutions. And I guess with a CMS or any headless environment, being able to actually split that page out instead of having one big payload that gets fully server rendered. Because then the problem you've got is your server rendering is only as fast as your slowest database query.
Yeah, exactly.
Doing bits of it on the client means you can start to hydrate.
Yeah, that's an interesting idea. And I that got me wondering once, like GitHub was affected by some AWS problems.
Mm-hmm.
And what they said is that only the search is impacted, everything else is not impacted.
Yeah.
And that's how they can be resilient to any component's failure, and they still provide you with most of the service, but only one thing is impacted.
Yeah.
That thing you can stretch it to performance. If something is going slower, it's fine. Just don't make everything suffer from it.
Yeah, it's pretty elegant, right?
Yeah. And then you guarantee as much as you can the good experience of the performant website.
Exactly, yeah.
Maybe let's touch other topics, from the CDN and above in the next video.
Sounds perfect.
Thanks.